and I'm happy to be here to discuss California Homeownership Task Force and what that means to potential homeowners in the future. I represent North Orange County, and I'm proud to do this now for my 4th term. Housing as a policy issue has been an area I'm focusing on. I sit on the housing committee. Homelessness and housing, homeownership, rentals, all of those are extremely important to me as not only a legislator, but as a parent of 4 young adults. I've seen 2 of my own children move to other states because of the prices of housing. But we also know production is extremely low compared to what we need for our workforce. So with that, we will be discussing that today. We also know that before the pandemic, we were facing a crisis when it came to housing, and the pandemic has made that one of the worst in our nation as far as a housing crisis. We've seen families throughout the state now, because of the pandemic, be on the brink of foreclosure, and also could even move into homelessness, which is exactly what we don't want. We certainly have been working on a moratorium for rent relief, also trying to work to make sure that our landlords get some kind of relief as well. But we know that as it's impacted many in California, our minority families and millennials have been disproportionately affected. And again, even before the pandemic, minority homeownership is at its lowest since 1996. And the lack of affordable homes near transit has pushed working families further and further away. And those commutes just become unbearable. I have to just give a testimony here. My young son, who was working in downtown LA before the pandemic, renting, and at a very high rate for an entry-level position, then moved home during the pandemic, and before the pandemic was commuting an hour and a half each way, and would often be getting up at 5:30 in the morning and not returning home till about 9 o'clock at night. And he's young, has energy, but I'm thinking of that mom or even dad who have young children, and they're trying to even get home before the sun goes down for whether it's sports. And so this is a huge family issue. We know commuters, it's not just the time on the freeways, but it's the time away from their families and so forth. This bill that we are going to be working on, which is AB 1090, the master plan on homeownership, is something that I'm really passionate about. This will establish the legislative task force on the California master plan on home ownership. Some of us in recent years have read more and more. There's actually books being written about redlining, about, I know when my family moved into Fullerton, which is North Orange County, Fullerton, the city is really, if you want to say, built in quadrants, and one of the quadrants is definitely considered the Latino neighborhood. And that was not by accident. It was by design. And we certainly know that the families that bought those homes in the late 50s, early 60s are now, many of them in their 80s. Their younger children are sometimes, if possible, able to attain those homes, but for many of them, they're not. And so their parents being able to get a home in the early 1960s, and now to see that owning a home for their children is less of a possibility is really so discouraging. So with that, I want to introduce our first speaker, and it is former member of the Assembly and representative of the 200, Joe Coto. Welcome, Assembly member, and thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Assembly member, and I want to compliment you and commend you and your team for authoring AB 1090. Thank you for addressing, which is a serious, serious crisis in our state. A little background on the 200 organization. It was created following the recent housing and foreclosure crisis, which had resulted, and as all of you know, in Latino, African American, Asian, and Native American communities being disproportionately financially decimated. Latinos lost 177 billion in assets. African Americans lost 144 billion in assets, and Asians lost 54% of their wealth. The foreclosure rates of Latinos and African Americans were 240% and 140% higher than that of white families. Unfortunately, wealth that had taken our community some 30 years to accumulate was lost in a short span of a few years. It created the largest wealth gap since the Great Depression. Now, the 200 organization was initially organized and included such civil rights stalwarts as Cruz Reynoso, who you'll remember was a Supreme Court justice. It included Herman Gallegos, who was the founder of the National Council of La Raza, included George Dean from the Urban League, Joey Quinto, who is the publisher of the Filipino statewide newspaper. It included Steve Figueroa out of the Inland Empire. John Gamboa was one of the early creators of the organization. He was the initial co-founder of the Redlining Institute, and Robert Apodaca, who is with us today, of course, who was an activist with the Frente en Casa organizations in Berkeley. Now, our focus has been on eliminating policies that inhibit homeownership and advocating for new policies in federal and state agencies that will stimulate housing production and increase housing opportunities. I want to encourage all of you, if you haven't, to view our redlining video. It's titled Redlining, a Legacy of Housing Discrimination. And this video explains how the federal government initiated programs and funding and agencies to promote home ownership for people in this country. And white people were able to take advantage of these programs and these funding sources and accumulate enormous amounts of wealth. But those very same programs and funding sources and agencies that were created prevented us and eliminated the possibility for Latinos, African Americans, Asians, and Native Americans from benefiting from those programs. So we've conducted up and down the state, we've organized problem-solving sessions. We've gone to San Diego, to Fresno, to Oakland, to LA, Riverside, the Silicon Valley, and other parts of the state to try to educate and activate, if you will, communities of color about the significance and the importance of home ownership, and educate them about the work that the 200 is doing to promote home ownership, and all of the information that you've provided. And there's a lot of information about how, again, it's almost impossible for a Latino and African American to be able to buy and own their own home in the state of California. So again, Assembly Member, I just want to thank you for taking on this challenge and for preparing a master plan for home ownership for our state. It is of utmost importance and critically needed for our community. So thank you very, very much for this opportunity, and thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Assembly Member, and your work, not only during your tenure as an Assembly Member, but now speaks volumes about who you are. And this effort, I will just let you know that as a classroom teacher for almost 30 years. And we know that education policies has many times disenfranchised our students. We see with COVID-19, the health disparities, where when we look across the state and we look to see who in fact is getting the vaccine, we see that our Latino, Latinx community, Black communities are lagging behind. So this is not a surprise, but what I think that is different, and I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to get this all the way through, is when you make a plan, it sets up goals, and it sets up, in essence, a watchdog that says this is important, and we are going to do everything we can to help attain this homeownership where we know we've lacked before. So sometimes you have to set the goal and have the parameters before you can do anything about it. So I thank you. I do notice Assemblymember Mike Gibson has joined us, so we'll allow him to make just a few remarks, and then we'll go to our next speaker because I know he is just jumping on for a few minutes here. Assemblymember Mike Gibson, did you have any comments that you wanted to make before we go to our next speaker?
Well, I just thank you very much, Assemblywoman. I just want to say thank you very much for gathering us all together, and it's great hearing from former Assemblymember Joe. Joe, it's great to see you. It's great to hear. I've read a lot of bills since I was elected 2014 that you authored. Great legislation, and great to have you as a leader in the state of California, and great seeing you in this space. I want to echo to something you said. We must talk about home ownership because that is a piece of the American dream for African American Latinos. That's what we can leave our generation. My parents, when they left this earth, they didn't leave their children in debt. They left us an inheritance. And that's the way it's supposed to be. And that's the way the Bible talks about for us to do that. And home ownership is absolutely one of those kinds of ways of doing that. And so I'm just grateful to be a part and listening in. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember. Next we have with us is Jennifer Hernandez, and I've had the opportunity to hear her speak on several panels in the past related to housing and CEQA. And she is with Holland and Knight, an attorney, has done quite an extensive work on CEQA, on redlining, and she is going to go into detail about the federal and state policies that have actually made it harder for, as we said, our communities of color to attain home ownership. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for recognizing the importance of home ownership in the housing puzzle. There's no question we need housing for our unhoused, we need supportive housing, transitional housing, affordable housing, but the idea that home ownership had kind of slipped off the priority list was never okay. And it's terrific based on all the work with the 200 and others, and I'm proud to represent the 200. That it is back on the table. Today, I'm actually subbing for Richard Rothstein, who houses co-offices with the 200. Can you guys see that slide? I've just got 3 of these, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. But Richard Rothstein has done a terrific book called Color of Law, and if you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so, because redlining in California is often thought of as like, oh, maybe that's a deep South kind of thing. No, I'm just going to share one quick story that hit really hard for me, because my grandmother from Mexico, I have sort of Italian, German grandparents and then Mexican grandparents. My grandmother from Mexico was a Rosie the Riveter in Richmond, California. And when the war effort started up in Richmond, World War II, housing for newly imported workers was critical. And white workers were given the opportunity for no down payment, single family home ownership, as long as they allowed one room in their house to be rented to another white worker. But a white worker in the shipyards was allowed to become a homeowner. A Black or Latino worker was allowed to rent in subsidized product that we would recognize as very substandard rooming house, and was never offered the opportunity for home ownership. After the war, the various factories that were pretty integrated racially and by gender went back into their private sector. And Richard Rothstein tells the story of Ford that moved down to Milpitas, which is at the edge of Silicon Valley. And the Ford Motor Company had a very nicely integrated workforce, but the white homeowners could move and trade their equity from Richmond to Milpitas. The Black workers didn't have equity, and immediately Milpitas, then part of unincorporated Santa Clara County, required large lot sizes, raised development fees, zoned for single family homes only, and those are redlining practices. They prevented the Black and Latino workers from Ford from being able to live near the new Ford plant. They also outlawed apartments. So now the minority, the communities of color workers from Ford, who had the same tenure on the job, had to commute from Richmond. It was 30 miles. And they sort of got a reputation for being late, and and they ended up with an almost all white workforce. And that is a California story from the 50s and 60s. And that story is why my Mexican grandparents couldn't buy a home for working in US Steel as part of AFL-CIO, even while my Sicilian and German grandparents could. It is a today story. It's not a yesterday story. And we continue to do redlining policies today, more in the name of climate and the environment, but we still can't get over the idea that it's okay to deprive communities of color of home ownership in government, including in California government. I'm going to quickly go through. This first slide shows the difference in home ownership. What does the difference translate to? It translates to a wealth gap. Homeowners have 44% more wealth than renters. So if a renter has a savings account of $5,000, the equivalent income homeowner has equity plus savings of $220,000. That's the difference. And that's been documented over and over and over again. Now I'm going to need to figure out how to go down, and thought I had this down. Shucks. Why can't, aha. So redlining, of course, is the practice of identifying mostly white neighborhoods, mostly minority neighborhoods, and then neighborhoods in between, and assigning them red, yellow, and green colors. And that red, yellow, green color code was all intended to either support subsidized mortgages, which is the only way anybody could afford to buy a home, or not support subsidized mortgages. And you think, oh my gosh, what a terrible practice. This is a 2020 map from the Southern California Association of Governments for the city of Huntington Beach, which Assemblymember Quirk-Silva, you of course know, it is not known for its racial diversity. It is not known for transit. But when you apply a single purpose policy goal like reducing vehicle miles traveled, and let's face it, who has to drive the farthest? People who have to drive to get the housing they can afford. Who's more likely to drive? People who don't get paid unless they're at the work site, not the keyboard economy. But look what SCAG did to achieve the California Air Resources Board goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled in this part of Southern California. It concentrated development. You see this little green dot? That's where the housing should go. Every place there's a red square, SCAG said, no new housing there. No, no, no. So we got two little red dots, new ghettos, because this was just about vehicle miles traveled. And they didn't disclose this, but this is the last of these. This is Long Beach. This area of Eastern Long Beach is highlighted in Richard Rothstein's book as classic redlined. Bigger parks, bigger schools, golf courses, all kinds of amenities. This part of Long Beach, a lot whiter, a lot wealthier. When all you do is look to reduce VMT, vehicle miles traveled, where did SCAG put housing? Poor, minority, poor communities of color. This is a map prescribing gentrification and displacement, and preserving the existing character and the existing homes. Now, I have to say, a lot of times local government gets beat up over these redlining issues. Local government had proposed all kinds of infill housing here. The legislature itself has encouraged accessory dwelling units, infill housing. But when you take an extremist, in this case, climate view, two things happen. One, you exacerbate redlining, and that was actually what SCAG concluded in its adopting resolution. California's climate goals conflict with housing goals. And the other thing is, you take people who really would prefer to stay in California, but they have to go to Texas to buy their homes. And that triples greenhouse gas emissions. And then the last of these, and actually we don't even need to go there if we're out of time. But I just want to say that—
No, please show, we want to see it.
Okay, so I need to figure out, I had it. That the 200, I am just stunned by this, right? I was on the California League of Conservation Voters board for 23 years. I am an enviro. I am an AFL-CIO person, right? That's my family, my continued family. The idea that California environmental law has turned against home ownership and turned against housing was, to me, a complete ridiculousness, right? It was clearly somebody just wasn't thinking. So we wrote letters to CARB and we said, please don't do this. And they met with us, and Mary Nichols met with us. And she said to the community of civil rights warriors, we have civil rights warriors on the 200. And those warriors assembled in Sacramento to meet with Mary Nichols and say, don't violate fair housing law again in the name of climate. Don't do it. And she said, but no, we're CARB. We understand your communities. We're going to give some of our cap and trade dollars to affordable housing projects. And affordable housing projects is code at CARB for rentals, subsidized rentals. And here was this woman who identified as a progressive Democrat telling these civil rights leaders, we're going to give you some housing dollars for projects, for affordable housing projects, and completely disregarding home ownership as a value. And John Gamboa reported at that meeting, Mary, we spent our careers getting out of the projects and you want to put us back in? That is why we ended up suing the California Air Resources Board over just 4 of the scores of measures they have in their scoping plan to reduce greenhouse gas. There has been an ongoing document cover-up. We had to actually sue under the Public Records Act to get the documentation from people like OPR, the Office of Planning and Research, Strategic Growth Council, EPA, Cal EPA, Natural Resources Agency. And the truth is they are still on this kick, and they are still making CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, as well as climate policy weaponized against products that are actually affordable for people. I'm going to just stop and come back. Hopefully I'm just back on the screen. This graph behind me is one of the pieces of information, and the last sentence I promise, from President Obama. President Obama proudly reported that as a result of the Clean Air Act enacted in 1972, we reduced pollution, from tailpipe emissions in cars, 98%. You tell us to take care of greenhouse gas, we'll make electric cars. You tell us to reduce other pollutants, we'll get rid of them. But what we didn't do was stop people from having children and stop those people from having jobs. So this increase is the increase in vehicle miles traveled, even while we reduced pollution. This nexus here, this whole concept that, no, we have to actually make housing not happen in the name of reducing vehicle miles traveled, couldn't be more singularly focused on communities of color households. And that's why we think it's so important that the legislature take leadership of this issue. Any agency left to its own devices is only going to pursue its own vision, but we need to restore some civil rights to this dialogue. and restore homeownership, which President Biden just called last month essential to building wealth and addressing racial inequities. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. That is, let me try to get, where's my camera, Joseph? What am I doing here?
You're on camera, so you're good.
Okay, can you take the slide down then?
Yes, just
so we
one
can-
moment.
I have a hard time. Okay, there we go.
There we
Thank you
are.
so
Sorry about
much, Jennifer. And we're speaking to the chorus here because many of you who have joined are already involved in housing issues for far longer than I have been. And you're doing everything you can at the local or county or state level to bring this to light. But again, I think if we want to do a single phrase, it is the big lie. And the big lie, a little bit of it came out yesterday with the state auditor's audit, Elaine Howell, on some of the CARB practices and so forth. But we have a lot of work to do. I think that this bill, a home ownership master plan, can not only shed light and give legislators, but also policymakers in other departments the information they need. I was on SCAG for a good handful of years. And of course, there were a lot of indicators, and we're talking almost 10 years ago, and yet they're drowned out by, and many times, I'll just be honest, the staff that's like, no, this is the way to go. This is the way to go, when it's clearly something that you're seeing firsthand if you want to talk about ownership, that we're not seeing. We're not seeing people of color, get into the market. So I've been devastated to see, not only in Orange County, so many inequities, whether it's housing or education, and just see lines of people struggling. But I want to thank the assembly member, the 200. I want to thank the housing people here. We have a long way to go with this, but we're optimistic that telling the truth, letting people see firsthand, they can see it in their neighborhoods. It's not hard to see. It's just getting the data out there so it's available and people understand really what the policies are that are impacting home ownership. But again, we want to thank you. Your support will mean a lot as we move this bill through, and encouraging those that represent you with a call, an email for this bill, because again, when we dig into policy, a lot of times it's just the top lines that people will read, and this may seem a little abstract to them. Meaning, if you say home ownership master plan, it's like, well, why do we need that? People can't even afford food, so they will make false comparisons. So we need to be on the same talking points and getting people to understand the severe inequities that have been caused by many of the policies we have put in place. But I think if you have any other thoughts, you could put them in the chat room. We're going to keep it short today, but we hope to see many of you in person. Thank you, Assembly Member, and thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. I think we're going to log off here. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I see some of my YIMBY friends, Sharon Ellis from Habitat, other people. Thank you. Bye-bye.